And this actually brings up an interesting evolutionary point. Well, people say, well, addiction is bad for you. And if it's heritable, why weren't those genes just disfavored? Maybe they're bad. Like, why do they get into the next generation? And so you're saying, well, can you have a genetic predisposition for stronger stress responses? Well, yes, certainly you can. In other words, you can inherit variants.
Dr. David Linden is a leading professor of neuroscience at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He's a distinguished researcher and the author of multiple books, including his latest book called Unique, The New Science of Human Individuality. I have read the book. It's remarkable and thought-provoking, and I strongly recommend everyone to read this incredible book. It's my honor to welcome Dr. David Linden. Dr. Linden, welcome.
Thank you for having me today.
I would like to start by quoting from your book, Unique. In Unique, you wrote that genes are built to be modified by experience. Could you tell us more about that?
Well, certainly. So we've got about 20,000 genes in the human genome. And we now know from expression profiling studies that in an average cell, like let's pick, say, a pyramidal neuron in the neocortex, at any given time, maybe about 13,000 of those genes are actually being expressed and making protein, and the rest are silent. And so all of our cells have all of our genes all the time. And of course, a given cell, you don't want it to do every function. In other words, the proteins that are involved in secreting stomach acid from the cells in the lining of their stomach, you don't want those to be active in neurons or in your skin. The genes that are responsible for growing hair in your skin, you don't want those to be present in your liver, for example. So we have means of turning genes on and off. And there are some ways of turning genes off rather permanently. And this involves attaching methyl groups to DNA. So this is called DNA methylation. Another one is to attach acetyl groups to the histone proteins that the DNA winds around on the chromosomes, and that's called histone acetylation. And these are ways of regulating gene expression. So some genes, you want them off all the time. If you're a brain cell, you don't want to express those genes involved in secreting stomach acid ever in your life. But there are other genes that you want to regulate on a moment-to-moment basis. For example, there are genes that you want to express at the beginning of sleep and through the night, but turn off in the morning. There are other genes that you want to express as you wake up or prior to waking up in the morning, but for their expression to be down by the time the evening comes. There are also genes that you want to be turned on and off in response to certain experiences, whether these are sort of physiological experiences like eating food or more psychological experiences like the things that go through your day and set down memories. So, for example, encoding memories, for us to have the memories of this interview right now, part of what is encoding those in the long term are turning on or off various genes in the neurons in our brain in order to change the functions of neurons and write the memory into those circuits.
In Unique, you talk about experience, and many people, when they think of experience, they think of upbringing or childhood only, but your definition is much more broader than that. Could you talk to us about what is experience?
Well, right. In English, we have this expression called nature versus nurture, meaning that, for certain traits that people have, how much is contributed by the genetic material they inherit from their parents, and how much is contributed by nurture. And nurture, people use it to mean how your parents raised you and how they treated you socially. But I think that's important, but it is too small of a term because what influences traits is not just social experience in the family, it's social experience in the entire world, in the community, in your entire life. But it's also all kinds of biological experience. It is the foods you eat, the foods your mother ate when she was carrying you in utero, the infections that she fought off when she was carrying you in utero, the infections you've fought off, everything that can happen to you, your exposure to pollutants in the environment, your exposure to hormonal changes that occur over the course of your life. So that is why I like to say experience rather than nurture, because we should, when we think about how human traits happen, traits ranging from physical traits like height to behavioral traits like risk-taking. All those things tend to be a combination of heritable traits that we inherit from our parents and experience considered in the broadest way, as we've just discussed.
Are genes more difficult to be modified by experience in adulthood?
Well, so that's a really good question, and the answer, it depends upon the biological system that you're talking about. So yes, I would say generally speaking, yes, and in the nervous system, very much so. So there are these periods that people talk about in the nervous system called critical periods, periods where you need the experience in order to wire up your brain properly. So for example, if you're born, but we tape your eyes closed at the moment you're born, or if you have a problem with your lens or your retina, for example, that means that you're not processing visual signals and they can't get to your brain. Even if we say fixed that later when you were 3 years old, there is a critical period early in life where visual experience coming into your eyes, that experience actually drives the refinement of visual circuits that lead from your retina to your brain and then through the visual pathways in your brain. And if you don't have that experience early, then you won't wire up the visual parts of your brain properly. Another way this comes out has to do with speech accent. So if you learn a language when you were a child, you're likely to have a perfect speech accent. You will adopt precisely the speech patterns of the people uh, around you. Whereas if you are only exposed to a new language, let's say you try to learn a new language as an adult, you can get very good, but you're very unlikely to have a perfect accent. And that has to do with critical periods in the auditory system when our brains are developing, you know, they're very, brains are very plastic and modifiable in the first 5 years of life, and then they really stay somewhat modifiable through puberty up until about age 20. Uh, in those times, then the sounds that we hear modify the auditory circuits in our brain that allow us to hear distinctions in language and in other sounds. And that as we lose that ability to modify them, then our ability to hear these subtle distinctions and to have a perfect local accent in a new language is lost.
Yes. One of the things that I learned from you is something called random development. What is random development, and does that concept apply only in utero or also in childhood and adulthood?
Right. So yeah, what we call random, I would actually call it pseudo-random development because I'm not meaning to say that once you're born, your body and your brain develop randomly. They don't. They're under the control of your genes. But what I'm trying to say is that development is stochastic or pseudo-random. And what I mean to say is, like, if we were to take the brain for an example, my favorite part of the body, uh, the genome are 19 to 20,000 genes that we have. It doesn't make a precise blueprint for the nervous system. Like we have whatever, about 90 billion neurons, and each one makes on the average 5,000 connections. So that's a lot of connections. And it's not like we can look in the DNA and then I can draw you a precise wiring diagram like you would have in electronics that say, okay, this neuron is going to precisely connect to all this one and then give you a list of about 5,000 cells that they connect to. The genome doesn't specify a wiring diagram for the brain. It specifies a more general, vague recipe. So rather than saying, okay, you particular neuron over there in the thalamus, grow dorsally and then cross the midline for 2 millimeters and then connect to this neuron. No, it says, all right, you group of neurons in the thalamus, you thousands of neurons, about half of you grow dorsally towards the top of the brain, and about the other half of you cross the midline and go somewhere else. But in any individual, even in two monozygotic twins that have the very same DNA variants, they won't grow the exact same way. So in one twin, maybe 45% of the neurons will cross the midline, and another one, 60%. So the average is 50%, but there is this pseudo-random stochastic variation. And so when we look at monozygotic twins, which people call identical twins, but that's not really true. They're not really identical. They're already non-identical even at the moment of birth. And you might say, well, how can that be? They have the very same DNA, and they were lying right next to each other in utero. So presumably they're experiencing very similar intrauterine environment while they're developing, yet still they're not exactly the same. And so, for example, if we were to take monozygotic twins and put them in a CT scanner and measure the volume of some organ, let's say the liver, they're not going to be exactly precisely the same because of this pseudo-random nature of development. So if we were to elaborate, take the term nature versus nurture, I would say a more accurate, although more cumbersome way to rephrase that, that's more accurate would be heredity interacting with the environment, of course, very broadly considered, as we just discussed, as filtered through the stochastic nature of development, which throws this kind of variation in, even when these other things are held constant. There is a neurogeneticist in Ireland named Kevin Mitchell, whose work I admire, and he has a nice phrase. He says, even using the same recipe, you don't bake the same cake twice.
I,
Every time you bake it, there's a little bit of variation. It's a little
yes.
higher, a little bit, the texture, the size changes a little bit. And I think that's a nice way of capturing the idea of the stochastic pseudo-random nature of development.
Yes, I just wanted to give you this analogy. It's like one spoon of sugar can be one spoon, but different quantity in each when you bake a recipe.
That's right. That's a very good analogy. It's not a precise measure. It might be a little more rounded or totally flat from person to person. Yeah.
Yes, and this randomness, pseudo-randomness of development continue only in utero or also continues in childhood while they're developing.
Yeah, no, it continues in childhood. So the pseudo-random nature of development continues in childhood. And what it means is that you can have the very same experiences as another person, but they don't necessarily change your nervous system or your
Mhm.
body in precisely the same way, although on average they tend to.
I want to quote something from your book. You say that heredity interacts with the environment, providing potential for a trait, but environmental conditions influence whether that potential will be fully realized. And my question is, if a potential isn't realized during development, can it still be realized later in life? Let's say once into adulthood, or once it's lost forever.
Well, it depends on the trait. Let's take human height as an example. If you look at societies that are affluent, where people get enough to eat, where they get medical care, where isn't terrible pollution or toxins in their environment, then in that situation, the trait of height is roughly 80% heritable. But if you go to poor situations where people don't get enough nutrition and they may be battling infectious disease or environmental toxins, where children don't get to play and move around properly, then height is less heritable. In other words, people can't achieve their genetic potential for the trait of height. And, in that case, you can't make up for it when you're adult because the period where you're going to grow in height is limited to early life. So if you don't get the proper nutrition early in life, you're not going to achieve your potential for height, even if you start getting that nutrition, say, when you're 20 years old.
Yes.
And the same thing is true for the development of the brain. As a matter of fact, if you look at, certain cognitive traits, so for example, general intelligence is a mildly heritable trait. It's mostly not, but it's the estimates keep going down and down and down as we get more data. Right now, people say, oh, about 25% or 30% heritability for intelligence. But again, that's in affluent cultures. If you go to places where people, again, don't get adequate nutrition, medical care, they're dealing with toxins, pollution in the environment, then the heritability for general intelligence goes down because their brains and their nervous system don't develop properly. And in many of these cases, yeah, you can't make it up later. There's a critical time that occurs early in life. This happens in some really interesting ways. One of the books I wrote earlier was about the sense of touch. And it turns out that touch is not optional for proper human development. If infants don't receive touch stimulation on their bodies in the first 2 years of life, a disaster unfolds. And the disaster is both neuropsychiatric. In other words, people have reduced intelligence, they have more problems with emotional regulation, they're more likely to have epilepsy, but also they have diminished immune systems, digestive problems, all kinds of problems. And the reason we know this is that there are certain places in the world where there have been orphanages that have been understaffed, where the people taking care of the babies don't have the time to hold the baby and give it tactile stimulation. The baby is just, they prop up the bottle and they go on to the next baby, not because they're not good people, but because there just aren't enough people to do it. This particularly happened in Romania during the time of the dictator Ceausescu. He banned artificial birth control and abortion. And so there were very many unwanted children during that period, and the orphanages were understaffed. So you had a whole generation of orphanage babies that were touch deprived and then had all these cascading medical problems then throughout their lives. And most of them are still alive today. And these problems, unfortunately, can't be reversed with really any kind of therapy later in life. If you don't get it within the first 2 years, you're going to then bear those problems forever.
Our brain uses memories to make decisions and predict the future, and the brain is this big prediction machine. And in your book, you talk about there is the mismatch between how we revive our memory and how often they fail us is striking. And my question is there a way to find which of our thoughts and memories are misleading and which are truthful?
No, unless it's something that we can fact check. In other words, you might say, "Oh, I have this memory of when I was a child, I went here and I did this," and then, like, you ask your mother, and she says, "No, it wasn't there. It was this other place." So, aside from fact checking, no, there's no biological way to tell, which memories we have are accurate and which ones are either completely wrong or degraded. And I think the thing to keep in mind is that it's harder and harder to have accurate memories for experiences that are repeated all the time. Like if you eat breakfast every day of your life, unless you eat the very same thing for breakfast, if I said, well, what did you have for breakfast 27 days ago? That's going to be a very hard thing for you to just bring to mind, obviously, because maybe you eat different breakfasts every day and the memory has been rendered generic. Or one of the examples I like to use in the book is if you've only visited the beach once in your life, you probably have a lot of very clear and detailed memories. But if you visited the beach 100 times in your life, you're probably not, and I say, well, what happened the 43rd time you went to the beach? You probably won't be able to tell me. We'll say, well, I know general things like I put on sunscreen, I lie on the sand, I go swimming. Maybe I like to eat this kind of food while I'm there, or maybe I, play this game. But they're generic memories. You're not allowed, putting, and I think the important thing to realize is that memory is useful for guiding our later decisions, as you correctly said earlier. And in some ways, memories that have been rendered generic and have blurred through repetition are actually more useful. The average, if you will, is more useful in guiding our decisions than 100 separate detailed memories of going to the beach would be. In other words, uh, so, of course, memories are tend to be written more accurately and more strongly by emotional experience, right?
Mhm.
So maybe I've been to the beach 100 times in my life, but I remember very well the day someone drowned and had to be rescued because that's a very emotional experience.
Yes.
Whereas I don't remember the time where I just went there and, it was an average day at the beach and nothing unusual. So, I'm an old guy. So in my time, people would always say, in the United States, people would say, oh, everyone remembers where they were when they learned that President Kennedy was assassinated. This happened in the 1960s, right? And so for Americans of a certain age, that's something that really sticks in the mind. And I think there would be similar things for very emotional or disastrous things that happened in different places in the world. And this is a common human experience because we know that the hormones and neurotransmitters that are associated with emotion, that they modify brain circuits in a way to write memory very strongly into the brain.
Is emotion and memory stronger because it connects to the amygdala, like especially if it's traumatizing? Is that one of the reason or plain?
Well, yeah, it's not just the amygdala. So the amygdala is particularly important in fear and some negative emotions, but you can write memories very strongly from very positive emotions as well. So, for example, when I proposed marriage to my wife, that was a very happy day. And I have very detailed memories of that experience. It probably didn't involve my amygdala at all.
Yes.
What we do know is that there are certain neurotransmitters that tend to be associated with emotional states. And these tend to be the slower acting neurotransmitters, the so-called neuromodulators. So we're talking about things like dopamine and norepinephrine and serotonin. So the levels of these neurotransmitters can influence the strength with which memories are written, even if what they're doing is they're actually modulating synapses that use different neurotransmitters that act more quickly, like glutamate and gamma aminobutyric acid. Uh, so dopamine can modulate a glutamate using synapse as a way to store to write something into memory strongly.
To what extent is stress heritable, and to what extent is it experience, and how much of it is random development? And if someone's carry a strong predisposition for genetical predisposition for stress and had bad experience, whether the mother was sick during pregnancy or whether in childhood, uh, to what extent they can overcome their stress into adulthood?
Right. So that's a several part questions, and they're all good parts. And so let me sort of break it down. So biologically, what do we mean when we say stress? Well, stress is involved with activation of the hypothalamo pituitary adrenal axis. So we're talking about secretion of stress hormones like cortisol and also adrenaline. We're talking about activation of the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, the so-called fight or flight response. So I think the important thing is a lot of people think about stress in the psychological realm. Oh, I have stress because I'm worried about this exam. I have stress because I'm worried that I might be sacked from my job. But stress isn't just a psychological thing. Stress has a physiological substrates. And so it's something that we can study rather objectively. And so you're saying, well, can you have a genetic predisposition for stronger stress responses? Well, yes, certainly you can. In other words, you can inherit variants, genetic variants that mean that your sympathetic nervous system tends to be more strongly activated in fight or flight situations than another person.
Yes.
That can occur from a result of experience, but it's also partially heritable uh, as well. So if you ask, well, can we overcome this? Yeah, we can, because it turns out that the parts of the brain that control the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and the parts of the brain that control the stress hormone axes, they are not walled off from the rest of the brain. In other words, they connect to higher centers. They connect to your neocortex, your striatum, your hippocampus, your amygdala. And so what that means is that you can adopt behaviors to ameliorate your stress. So, for example, people who are having panic attacks can also often reduce their stress response by engaging in certain pattern breathing. That's a good method of doing it. Meditative practice is good for a lot of people in modulating their stress response. We know that having good sleep hygiene and getting good sleep and not staying up too late and not drinking too much coffee will help reduce stress responses. So there are definitely things that we can do behaviorally as adults to help us cope with stress in the world.
There are two stress pathways. There is the cortex stress pathway, and there is the amygdala pathway. Is both of these, first of all, can you talk to us about those two pathways? And do you have advice to deal with each pathway differently?
Well, yeah, I mean, the truth is the pathways, so both pathways are engaged in stress, both the cortisol pathway and the epinephrine norepinephrine pathway. And epinephrine and norepinephrine actually come from two different sources. One of them, because it's interesting, norepinephrine is both a neurotransmitter and a hormone. It's a hormone in the sense that it's a compound that's released in the blood and then goes everywhere in the body. It's also a neurotransmitter because it's released from the endings of neurons into synapses to fuse a very short distance to affect another neuron or a muscle or a glial cell or something nearby. So it has two different actions. Norepinephrine in the body can either come from secretion from the adrenal gland, or it can come from the release from neurons of the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Both those forms of norepinephrine, either neurotransmitter style norepinephrine or hormonal style norepinephrine, can act on norepinephrine receptors. They're on your immune cells, they're in your gut, they're in your lungs, they're in your heart, they're all throughout your body, and they're really important in a surprising number of things. They're even present on cancer cells in many types of cancer. And that's why, for example, people are now using um, drugs that block the beta norepinephrine receptor in pancreatic cancer and a few other cancers because they think that those can help extend lifespan because norepinephrine can both dampen the immune cells that are patrolling the edges of tumors and nibble away at them, and can also help stimulate cancer cells to divide and spread. So there are all kinds of benefits. That said, um, a lot of people get very upset about, oh, cortisol is a stress hormone. I always want it to be low. Well, no, you don't. Cortisol naturally has a rhythm over the course of your day. You want your cortisol to peak in the morning, a couple of hours after you wake, because that's what helps you have the energy to power you through the most productive time of your day and get work done and do things and be effective in the world. And then you want cortisol to fall during the afternoon and the evening and then only start rising again before you wake. So it's not like, oh, well, I just always want, cortisol is bad. It's a stress hormone. So we always want it to be low, 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 low. No, we want it to vary over the course of the day, but in a very particular pattern that suits us well. Now, when cortisol tends to be high chronically, that's when you get a lot of bad medical outcomes, both neuropsychiatric and more generally throughout the body.
What diseases are associated with medical psychiatric? Are there examples?
Well, so high cortisol can be associated with persistent depression that doesn't respond to treatment, and it can be associated with anxiety and sometimes with obsessive compulsive disorder, and probably some others that I don't actually know about. Yeah.
Yes. And I want to ask you about OCD and ADHD. To what extent
Mhm.
are those genetics? To what extent are they affected by experience and randoms of development? And is it possible to rewire the brain circuits in those diseases?
So that's a great question. So I don't actually have the heritability numbers in front of me for OCD and ADHD. If I were guessing, I would guess it would be in the vicinity of 40%
Hmm.
of the variation in those traits is heritable, but I don't actually have those numbers lying in front of me right now, so that's just a guess. But the truth is, pretty much almost every neuropsychiatric condition is partially heritable. The most heritable are things like schizophrenia and autism, which tend to be up around 80%. Um, Less heritable are phenomena like depression in the middle, bipolar disorder. So these conditions have a heritable component, but it's far from all of it. And in many cases, the way we conceive of the risk of neuropsychiatric disease is that we're thinking in terms of populations. When we say, oh, 40% heritability, that doesn't mean that for an individual, 40% of the risk is heritable. That means for the entire population. So, in other words, there may be some people that are unlucky enough to carry genetic variants that are so strong that no matter what their experience in the world is, they're going to develop schizophrenia because they just got the very bad genetic variants. And there are going to be other people who carried variants that make them pretty schizophrenia resistant, but not 100% resistant. So it may be that experiences in the world that are extremely intense and devastating and traumatizing could drive them to schizophrenia, but it would take a lot to do it. And for most people, there's a continuum. So, the way we conceptualize this for depression and schizophrenia and most neuropsychiatric conditions is that there is sort of a balance between experience and heredity, and again, also the random, pseudo-random nature of development that in the end determines whether you will actually develop those particular neuropsychiatric traits. Uh, but yeah, there are a number of things that you can do to help in certain neuropsychiatric diseases. Depression, for example, benefits enormously from physical exercise. So physical exercise is nearly as effective a therapy for depression as the commonly prescribed SSRI antidepressants like Prozac and Celexa uh, are. And unlike those drugs that can have serious side effects like brain fog and reduced interest in sex, uh, the side effects of exercise are all good.
Hmm.
Uh, you know, uh, Exercise is, the more we learn, the more physical exercise is looking good. It's good to keep depression at bay. It's good to keep your brain healthy as you age. And if you are a cancer survivor, it's good in reducing the chance of your cancer recurrence. It's just good. And, it used to be that the studies that we had that were examining exercise were all observational studies. Like we give people surveys and we say, well, how much do you exercise? Oh, and then like what diseases do you have or how do they recur? And the problem with that, first of all, is people aren't always honest when they answer the survey. But even if people are honest, you can imagine a lot of confounds. Like the people who tend to exercise may also tend to eat a better diet and have other healthy habits. Maybe they're less likely to smoke cigarettes. Maybe they're more likely to follow the instructions from their doctor. Then saying, well, is that really because of exercise or because the things that are correlated with exercise becomes harder? But we have a smaller number of studies that are actually randomized control studies where people say, all right, you folks with colorectal cancer, half of you, we're going to enroll you in a program where you do exercise class every day and it's really intensive. And the other half, we're just going to give you a pamphlet and then you do whatever you do. Now, some of the people who get the pamphlet will exercise anyway, but many of them won't. And then we will come back and we will follow over 8 years. And there was a great study that just came out this year. It was done in Australia and Canada for colorectal cancer. And the benefit of exercise was enormous. Like nobody could believe how big the effect was. It was something on the order of a 35% reduction in mortality 8 years out with exercise.
Yes.
If you would ask me to guess what the result would be, I wouldn't have guessed that it would be that high. But
Yeah.
it just underlines the fact that the evidence for the benefits of exercise it's only getting better as time goes on.
Yes. You have a lot of experience with addiction, and I would like to ask you a question about addiction. You
Mhm.
even have a YouTube video about addiction, and I've watched it fully. I recommend everyone to watch it as
Mhm.
well. And to what extent addiction, an estimate, is shaped by genetics and how much of it is shaped by experience? And could you talk to us about the link between stress and addiction?
Yeah, so these are great questions. So my recollection is that about 50% of the variation in addiction is heritable. And this actually brings up an interesting evolutionary point. Well, people say, well, addiction is bad for you. And if it's heritable, why weren't those genes just disfavored? Maybe they're bad. Like, why do they get into the next generation? And there's two reasons. One of them is that addiction doesn't tend to kill you before you have children. So, in other words, it kills you slowly. So you have your children, you've passed the genes, and so if it reduces your lifespan by 20 years, it doesn't matter, right? You've already passed your genes on, so they got into the next generation. So selection isn't going to act on that trait. The other thing is that addiction is a trait that correlates with things that can benefit you very well. So addiction correlates with um, risk-taking and novelty seeking. Well, this risk-taking and novelty seeking can be bad sometimes, but they can be good too, like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Jensen Huang and like our heroes of people who've started remarkably successful companies, for example, or people in all kinds of aspects of the world, risk-taking and novelty seeking have served them very, very well. So it's not just a negative trait that should be weeded out.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, all right. So yeah, propensity for addiction is about 50% heritable, and you're absolutely right that life stress really is a risk factor for addiction. So one of the things that's a risk factor for addiction is poverty. So if you're poor, you have more stress in your life. If you are always concerned, like you don't get enough to eat, you always worried, how am I going to stay healthy, keep my family safe, keep them warm, what's going to happen tomorrow. So these are psychological stresses, but also physical stresses. Maybe I have to do dangerous work with polluting chemicals in agriculture or in construction. For example, these are all stresses that are risk factors for addiction. So addiction goes up with poverty and it goes up with stress generally. Interestingly, poverty is also a risk factor for depression. Sometimes we think, oh, depression is only a disease of affluent societies. If you look among hunter-gatherers, people who live very traditionally, they don't have depression. It's not true. It's actually not true at all. Depression is found in every society, everywhere in the world. People have different cultural ideas about it. Some places admitting that you have depression is something that is seen as shameful. So people won't say, I'm depressed. They'll say, oh, I haven't been sleeping well, or my appetite's wrong. But really, what's wrong is they're depressed. Uh, and so there are different cultural ideas about it, but depression is there in every culture in the world, in every life circumstance. And the harder your life in terms of particularly things like being poor, the higher the incidence of depression, the higher the incidence of addiction.
Yes, and you talked about in the Huberman podcast also with brain inflammation, and I uh, wonder how many neuropsychiatric diseases are related or linked or associated with brain inflammation, like stress and anxiety and OCD and even schizophrenia.
Well, this is a very trendy thing right now in neuroscience. So right now, I mean, and in medicine generally, people are linking inflammatory processes to more and more diseases. And, again, like we talked about with cortisol, inflammation is useful. It's a natural response to infection. And so it's not like we want to make it so that it never happens. But the problem is when you get chronic inflammation that outlasts the infection or outlasts the tissue damage, then you really do have a risk for a number of bad things in the nervous system, including depression, including anxiety. And so you might think to yourself, oh, well, we have really good anti-inflammatory drugs. We have these drugs that act on the production of prostaglandins, things like ibuprofen and Tylenol and aspirin and and steroidal anti-inflammatories. Why don't we just treat depressed people with those and see if they get better? And so if you just give a whole population of depressed people ibuprofen, you don't see any improvement. But if you look at the subset of depressed people who we call treatment-resistant depression, these are people who haven't responded to several different antidepressant drugs. Their depression hasn't been alleviated by that treatment. And a lot of times these people have tried, a bunch of different things and it hasn't worked. In that population, It's early days, but there are starting to be some suggestions that perhaps among that subpopulation of depressed people, anti-inflammatory drugs may have some benefit. Very early days. It's a very exciting area, and we still don't really know that much about the link between inflammation and depression. Here's another interesting example, though. Certain there are certain diseases that are, or even treatments that are associated with high inflammation. So, for example, it used to be before the newest drugs that the standard treatment for hepatitis C was giving interferon alpha. That was the best therapy we had. And it turns out that like 60% of the people who were given interferon alpha therapy for the hepatitis became depressed while on the interferon alpha. Now, fortunately, when their course of interferon alpha was over, the depression alleviated. But certainly that indicates, interferon alpha is a pro-inflammatory cytokine in an immune stimulating molecule. And it turns out that if you look in certain other diseases, there can be very persistently elevated levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, like interleukin 6 is one of them, for example. So if you look in multiple sclerosis or in transverse myelitis, for example, both of these diseases, people often have very, very high levels of interleukin 6, and they also have very high levels of depression, particularly very severe depression leading to suicidal ideation. And so that suggests that perhaps interleukin 6 of one or some of the other pro-inflammatory cytokines may very well be risk factors for depression, and that therapies designed to interfere with them might be useful antidepressive therapies in the future. Now, you could say, oh, well, but transverse myelitis and multiple sclerosis, they're very severe diseases. Maybe you're just depressed because you're paralyzed, and that's a depressing thing to think about. But if you look, for example, if you compare people with multiple sclerosis with people who have spinal cord injury, people with spinal cord injury have fairly normal levels of severe depression, whereas people with multiple sclerosis have massively elevated levels of severe depression. So it doesn't just seem to be, well, I'm depressed about my life circumstances because I'm paralyzed or intermittently paralyzed. It really seems to be more likely related to the physiology of multiple sclerosis or transverse myelitis, very likely mediated through these pro-inflammatory cytokines.
And nowadays also we're living in very inflammatory period, like we're constantly getting inflammation from the environment, from food. And I wonder if they try, it's very difficult to do control studies like this, but I wonder if they are linking those environmental toxin and food and this chronic inflammation to all kind of diseases.
Right. So right now, as I'm sure you're well aware, there is a mania for gut inflammation and
Yes.
people claiming its involvement in lots of disease states. And I'm not an expert in this, but my impression is that some of that is going to it's not some of that is going to turn out to be real, but probably far from all of it. I mean, there's so many claims that are being made that gut inflammation, if you go on the internet, people are implicating gut inflammation in everything bad that could ever happen to you. And not all that will turn out to be medically supported, I think, in the long run. And I think anytime someone is, trying to sell you something like a probiotic or a prebiotic or, a supplement, you have to be deeply suspicious of what's really going on there. I don't take any prebiotics or probiotics or supplements in my own daily health practice.
Yes. And can I ask you about the circadian rhythm, the role of genetics in the circadian rhythm and other factors that can affect the.
Well, right. So there's some really interesting thing that's been going on here. And so there are two different factors that we should think about in terms of the variation in the trade of human sleep. One is the duration of sleep that people naturally get. And of course, people's sleep is usually modified by all kinds of things, getting up for work, awakened by young children who are crying in the night, all sorts of things can happen. But if we ask, if people are not influenced by that, how many hours of sleep would they naturally get? So there's a distribution. The average is about 7, 8 hours a night. There are some people who are very long sleepers. Some people who are naturally short sleepers. A lot of the people who claim to be naturally short sleepers aren't really. They're lying because they think it sounds cool, like I'm such a hard-charging, hard-working person that I can get by on 3 hours of sleep. A lot of times that's not really true. If you actually take them to the sleep lab and study them, that's not the case. So that's one trait, is the total sleep duration. Another trait has to do with when, again, unencumbered by life circumstances like jobs or children or other responsibilities, when do they naturally wake up and fall asleep? And so there are genetic variants that we now know that impact both sleep duration and also sleep onset. So there are families where there are genetic variants that have been identified that result in people who like to go to sleep very early and people who are very late shifted and go to sleep very late. But of course, there are cultural factors too. So, for example, in Europe, people in Denmark are on average the earliest people to go to bed, and people in Spain are the latest to go to bed. And that's not due to genetic differences between Danes and Spaniards. It's due to cultural differences in how people live. The exciting thing about the genetic variants in sleep onset and these familial short or I'm sorry, later early sleepers is that in a number of cases, geneticists have identified the genes involved. And interestingly and reassuringly, these genes are genes that we already knew were involved in the circadian cycle. Uh, they were genes that oftentimes were originally discovered in fruit flies. Because you can mutate fruit flies and get flies that have activity. Flies sleep too, and you can get flies that have variations in these cycles. So these genes that were identified in fruit flies are also the same genes in humans that their variants tend to give rise to early or late sleep or short or long sleep that runs in families.
Is there a way to find out what is the ideal time for your genes to wake up or sleep, or what's your circadian rhythm?
Well, I think, I don't think you need to do any genetic analysis to know. The question is just if you are unencumbered by other considerations, if you don't have to go to work, if you're not waking up with small children, if there aren't other things, let's say you're on vacation for a long period of time, you've been able to reset to your natural rhythm. What is that? Well, that's your ideal.
We talked about that the brain is this prediction machine and it works on prediction and not receiving. Could you talk to us about this concept that the brain keeps predicting the future?
Yeah, really, that's what the brain is for, and this is an idea. The brain is sort of predicting the future, particularly the next few moments. Really, it's not a far future prediction machine so much as it is a near future prediction machine. And this is in all kinds of evaluation. Like, is that rock flying through the air going to hit me in the head, or will it pass by? Do I need to take evasive actions? Is that person walking down the street going to do me harm, or are they friendly, or do I have to worry about them? And this happens both at a very high level, but also at a very low level. I'm an old guy and I've been in the neuroscience business a long time. So I was sort of taught a reactive model of the brain. Oh, the brain's sitting there. Oh, okay. And then some information comes into the senses. You see something, you hear something, something happens on your skin, and then your brain responds to it, and then it emits a behavior. But actually, our brains, even when we are not doing anything particular, when we're just sort of spacing out and staring at the wall, our brains are busy trying to predict the next few moments. And this happens not just at a high level, but at a very low level. So, for example, we know that from Pavlov's time, so 100 plus years ago, we know that if Pavlov's dog sees a piece of meat, that they'll already begin to secrete stomach acid in advance, anticipating the meat getting there. So that is a very low level kind of prediction. If you see food or even think of food, you'll start salivating in your mouth. And not only that, but the chemical constituents of your saliva are different depending on the food you see. If I show you bread and you think you're about to eat bread, your saliva will have a lot of amylase enzymes to break down starches. If I show you meat, your saliva will have more protease enzymes to break down proteins. So this is a way in which the higher parts of your brain are modifying the reflexive parts of your brain to predict what's going to happen and uh, allow you to work better in the world. There was just a study that came out just this year that I thought was really, really fascinating. They had people in a brain scanner and they showed them synthetic faces that were looming, that were coming closer and closer to them. And the human face could either be a normal face or it could be a face that looked of someone who looked like they were diseased, like it had pock marks or pustules or something that looked like they were carrying a disease. Among the people, the response to the looming faces that were diseased, first of all, there was a larger activation of the amygdala that you mentioned earlier, which is sort of a fear and alertness center. But also, when they took blood from these people, they found early stages of immune system activation. So it seems like if you see someone who you think might infect you, your immune system is already starting to become active to anticipate the possibility of that infection. And that has to happen through the action of your brain. So I think it's a great example of how our brains work to predict the future.
Yes. Just talked about general intelligence, and I would like to ask about different types of intelligence, and that is emotional intelligence. How much of that is genetics and how much is shaped by experience, and to what extent emotional intelligence can be improved?
Yeah, the truth is there's definitely heritability in certain tasks, like the ability to infer emotion from hearing someone's tone of voice or seeing their facial expression. And this is something that people have studied a lot. The tests that people have devised for so-called emotional intelligence so far have not been that good.
Mhm.
And so I'm not a big fan of that literature, honestly. So, talking about the heritability of emotional intelligence, the studies that I've read so far, I'm not sure that they're very high quality. So I tend to leave that alone.
The genetic variant of it, or generally emotional intelligence itself?
Well, no, I mean, I think emotional intelligence is a real thing. I think I don't think we have necessarily
Enough data.
quantified it in large populations in a good way that has allowed for us to estimate heritability very well. But the truth is, if you're looking to guess the heritability of a behavioral trait, most behavioral traits, 30 to 50%. I mean, there are a few that are different, there are a few that are lower, there are a few that are higher, but most of them are 30 to 50%. So even without any information, I can have a guess that the heritability of emotional intelligence might be somewhere in that general area, probably more towards the lower end.
I would like to ask you about your book, Unique, The New Science of Human Individuality. Where can people buy it, and where can they follow your work as well?
Oh, well, so thank you. Yes, they can buy it at the normal places that you buy books, either in stores or online, and it's available in a number of different languages. I think 8 or 9 languages now. I think there's still some more translations underway. The usual online places where you can buy books, you can find my book, and I have a website called davidlinden.org where you can follow me, and I'm also on Blue Sky.
Tell us a little bit about your new book. I believe it's called The Real Science of Mind, Body, Medicine. Did I get it correctly?
That's correct. So I'm writing a book right now, The Real Science of Mind-Body Medicine, and it's about links between cognitive and emotional processes and disease, particularly things like cancer, chronic pain, um, depression, infectious disease, and it will be published in English in probably the summer or fall of 2027. So
Uh-huh.
it's only half written now. It's due at the English publisher in mid 2026, and then usually it takes about a year for it to come out. And then sometimes the translations can take longer after that. It depends. Sometimes they happen quickly. Sometimes they take a year or two.
Yeah, we look forward to it and more of your work and your project. Um, Thank you so much, Dr. Linden, for being with us today. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Thank you for sharing your time. I'm very grateful to have this conversation with you, and I hope once your new book is published and somewhere down the future, we can have this conversation again and we can talk about your new book, The Real Science of Mind and Body Medicine.
Thank you very much. I would appreciate that when it happens. Yes.
Yes, that would be good. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.